We're going to go ahead and go through the O's and I's of the humerus here. On the medial side, we have the lesser tubercle, which is the insertion point for subscapularis. Moving to the greater tubercle on the anterior side here, or kind of the superior portion of it, we have the insertion for supraspinatus. And then moving to the posterior side, we have the insertion point for infraspinatus. And then to the most posterior side of the greater tubercle, we have the insertion point for teres minor. Flipping back to the anterior side, we have our bicipital sulcus here. On the medial side of our bicipital sulcus, the most medial, we have our insertion point for our teres major. This is our major sandwich. Lateral to that, we have our insertion for the latissimus dorsi, and that is sandwiched by our insertion for the pectoralis major on the lateral side of the bicipital sulcus. On the lateral side of the shaft of the humerus, we have our deltoid tuberosity, which is our insertion point for our deltoid here. And then on the medial side of the shaft, or the medial side of the humeral shaft, we have our insertion point for our coracobrachialis. Coming down to the distal end of our anterior shaft here, we have our origin point for the brachialis. Moving to the lateral side, we have our lateral supraepicondylar ridge. Here, we have two origins here. This top origin is for the brachioradialis. Inferior to that, we have our origin for the extensor carpi radialis longus. And then down here on the lateral epicondyle, we have that's our common extensor point, and then that's also our point where we have our inconius originate. And then moving to the medial epicondyle, that's our common flexor attachment, and that's also the point where our pronator teres originates. Go ahead and flip at the bone posteriorly. We have two left. These are both heads of the triceps brachii, separated by the radial groove here. Superior to the radial groove, we have the lateral head of the triceps brachii, and inferior to the radial groove, we have the medial head of the triceps brachii. And that is all of the humerus. Okay, we're going to go through the radius here with origins and insertions. So we're going to go ahead and start at the proximal end here with the head of the radius. We have the radial tuberosity, which is the insertion point for the biceps brachii. On the proximal lateral third, we have the insertion point for the supinator. On the oblique line on the lateral side of the shaft of the radius, we have the insertion point for the pronator teres. Going ahead and over to the anterior middle shaft here portion, we have the origin point for the flexor pollicis longus. Let's just go ahead and flip it over. We have two other origins on here on the shaft. The proximal origin on the posterior shaft here is the abductor pollicis longus, and then inferior to that on the posterior side as well, we have the extensor pollicis brevis. And then if we come down here to the far distal end on the anterior side, we have the insertion point for the pronator quadratus. And then finally down here on the styloid process, we have the insertion point for the brachioradialis. And that is all of the O's and I's for the radius. All right, going through the O's and I's here of the ulna. We can go ahead and start at the proximal end here. We have the insertion point for the triceps brachii on the olecranon process. Let's go ahead and flip it around posteriorly. We have the insertion point here for the inconius. That's on the posterior side of the olecranon process and kind of the posterior lateral border of the ulna as well on the proximal end. So then we flip it to here, and in the supinator crest, we have the origin point for the supinator on the proximal end. We go ahead and go to the coronoid process here. We have the insertion point on the lateral side for the brachialis. On the medial side of the coronoid process, we have the origins for two muscles. Proximally, we have the insertion for the flexor digitorum superficialis, the only intermediate muscle on the anterior antebrachium. Distal to that, we have the origin point for the pronator teres. Go ahead and bring it down here to the 3/4 of the anterior medial shaft. We have the flexor digitorum profundus. And we come down here to the distal end of the ulna. We have the origin point for the pronator quadratus. Sorry, I'm holding it a bit low. Flip it here to the posterior side. We have three muscles, proximal, to distal here, we have the abductor pollicus longus, we have the extensor pollicus longus, and then most distal here we have the origin for the extensor indices. So that's abductor proximal, extensor in the middle, and then extensor indices at the bottom. And that is all the O's and I's of the ulna. All right, we're going over the O's and I's of the scapula here. So let's go ahead and start on the anterior portion of the scapula. Right here we have the subscapularis and the subscapular fossa. On the anterior medial border here of the scapula, you can see the insertion point for the serratus anterior here. Now, if we come up here to the coracoid process, if we go from medial to lateral here, we have the insertion point for the pectoralis minor. And then right next to that, we have the origin for the short head of the tricep brachii. And then finally, the most lateral point of the coracoid process, we have the origin point for the coracobrachialis. Sorry about that. And then we have the glenoid cavity here. Superior to the glenoid cavity, we have the supraglenoid tubercle, which is the origin point for the long head of the bicep brachii. And then we have the infraglenoid tubercle. That is the origin point for the long head of the tricep brachii. Go ahead and flip this around posteriorly now. On the acromion and the spine of the scapula here, we have kind of the inferior spine, I should say, but we have the origin point for the deltoids, the posterior and the middle head primarily. And then we have the insertion point on the superior spine of the scapula here for the trapezius. That's where the trapezius inserts. And then we have in the supraspinous fossa here, it's the origin point for the supraspinatus muscle. The infraspinous fossa here is the origin point for the infraspinatus muscle. And then we come down here, or we'll go up here first to start actually. At the superior angle, that's the insertion point for the levator scapulae. And then we have the superior portion of the medial border here on the posterior side. That's where our rhomboid minor inserts. And then inferior to that, on the same medial posterior border here, we have our insertion point for the rhomboid major. And then go ahead down here to our inferior angle on the posterior side. That's our origin point for our teres major. And then on the lateral border of this posterior side here, we have the origin point for the teres minor. And that is all of the points, O's and I's on the scapula. All right, I'm going to go over the muscles and the bony landmarks of the clavicle. So here we have a clavicle. This right here is going to be the origin for the clavicular head of pectoralis major. This lateral third of the clavicle right here on the anterior side and on the acromial end is going to be the origin for the anterior head of the deltoid. On the posterior side here, on the acromial end as well, we have the insertion point for trapezius, and then on the inferior portion of the scapula in the subclavian groove, we have the insertion point for subclavius. And that is all that we need to know on the clavicle.